welcome our audience and expert guests to the Pandemic History from the Bottom Up webinar. I particularly want to thank Manhattan Borough historian Rob Snyder and everyone involved in the movement of historians working to document this unique moment in time. I want to thank Will Buie. I want to thank Deidre Dinnigan. I want to thank Mike Frisch and Christine Ridarsky, as well as Savona Bailey McClain, whom I have stood with under the Harlem train tracks, and Nadia, DeLane. And I certainly want to thank Madison Marlowe and Penelope Cox from my office for helping to arrange this event. I know in this particular case, I love being, Zooming, but I sure would prefer hosting you in person. But a program like this is bound to be fascinating and informative, regardless of where it's hosted, because of all the amazing people I just mentioned. We certainly have panelists that have lots to talk about. The basics of what archiving and oral history are, how to start or get involved with archiving and oral history projects, as well as the resources and tools for archiving and oral history recording, what's accessible, what's easy and free to use, because people don't really know what archives are, they don't really know what oral history is, and goodness knows at this particular time between both pandemics, we have the pandemic health and the pandemic criminal justice and police not doing what they're supposed to do, and the great protesters. Historians do essential work researching, recording, and preserving our borough's diverse history and the stories of our neighborhoods and communities, and really all neighborhoods. But I only like Manhattan, just in case anybody didn't know that. But there is also a need for all kinds of people on the ground to collect and share stories about these pandemics, as well as the many historical events taking place during it, such as our current experiences with nationwide protests against police brutality. I just want to tell you one story about a protest. So Isabel works in our office. She lives in East Harlem, and she's really an artist in addition to being an amazing colleague. So she made 2 signs on Sunday for her sister and for her. And she was offered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for these signs. So it's a little weird that that's going on. So she said no, and she gave them away, which I never would have done, because I told her I'm going to wake up one day and Sotheby's going to have it for sale for $1 million, and she's going to feel terrible. It didn't faze her at all. The work our panelists and historians around the world are doing to help preserve the events and effects of these pandemics are essential for our city, state, and country to learn from the many mistakes made by those in leadership leading up to this crisis. We're all better equipped to support one another in the face of future epidemics, although I hope we don't have such things. One last note. Ever since the event we hosted on December 4th, when we celebrated then new borough historian Rob Snyder and the many other Manhattan historians present that evening at the wonderful Fire Museum, we have been working on a growing database of Manhattan historians. This database is inclusive and representative of all historians, from history department professors at colleges to walking tour guides, to museum owners, to folklore storytellers, to community activists. We welcome all those who work diligently to preserve the history of a singular street block and more. So if you know someone or you are someone who has not registered in our database and would like to be, as a historian in the broadest sense of the word, my favorite are the historians who know stickball in East Harlem, please contact Madison Marlowe in our office, and it's just MARLOW, standing for Madison Marlowe, at manhattanbp.nyc.gov, or you can just go to our website, and certainly info@manhattanbp.nyc.gov will also get to Madison. Thank you, Dr. Rob Snyder, and all the amazing people. I think some of you know that when I was Government Affairs Chair in the City Council, then Mayor Bloomberg wanted to take the municipal archives and send it to the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, which sounded to me like it was going to go to a warehouse somewhere with big walls and nobody would ever know they existed. So I put up a big fight and we won. But then it was very interesting. I don't think I ever told you this, Rob. When Mr. de Blasio came in, since I knew him, he said, Gale, it was very interesting. The papers had already been written up at the law department. All they had to do was a signature for municipal archives to go to DCAS. I went, oh my goodness, somebody lied to me because they told me it was not happening and no longer to worry and so on and so forth. So that's how I got to know the Roundtable of Archivists, because they were, I couldn't have done it without them. So I have great respect for every single person who's on this panel and who's listening and who knows our history and who understands the meaning of archives. Because as people say, if you are bound to repeat history, then you deserve what you get. That's my way of phrasing how important your work is. So Rob Snyder, thank you so much, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Borough President, and thank you everybody who's with us today. I think we're going to have a really great event. The title for this afternoon is Pandemic History from the Bottom Up, and the title was chosen really carefully. Unlike a top-down history about mayors and governors and presidents, which has its place, history from the bottom up takes a broader view. It looks at people who are not often thought of as powerful and important. And it takes in a diverse array of social groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, workers, people of all genders. There's great value in history from the bottom up during a pandemic. And a lot of us were reminded of this today in a great New York Times piece on the Mount Hope neighborhood in the Bronx. It was a great example of journalism as a first draft of history and history from the bottom up. That piece in the Times talked about how in Mount Hope in the Bronx, the number of commuters rose during the pandemic because so many essential workers from that neighborhood in the Bronx, hard hit as it was, were commuting into other parts of the city to do the essential work that we needed to keep the city running in hospitals and stores and in all sorts of other vital tasks. So we kept the city running during the pandemic, but it can also put the focus on the people who suffered disproportionately during the pandemic, particularly African-American, Latinx New Yorkers. Oral history lets people speak for themselves, and it gives them a voice in establishing the history of our times. It gets at both the immediate and the long-term perspectives that people have on the events that they're living through and that they remember. Oral history complements the work of archivists who collect widely, giving a home to objects and images and sounds that come beyond the world of narrow elites. Oral history and archiving together are essential for building an inclusive history that can record and help us understand the pandemic that we're living through, and everything from art to books to museum exhibits to documentaries. Today's speakers are experts at oral history, archiving, the arts, and sharing history through social media. We'll all leave today's session with a better knowledge of how to shape the stories of our time. If you've got questions, put them in the chat. Madison will feed them to me and I'll try to get them to our panelists. We'll also be sending out a resource sheet later today that pulls together the resources that our speakers brought to our session. And we'll be sending out another resource sheet later in the week that will pull together even more information. If you're on our mailing list, you'll get it automatically. If you're not on our mailing list, put your mailing address in the chat and we'll pick it up and we'll get to you that way. Our session today is moderated by Madison Marlowe and Luisa Lopez. They are working heroically in the background to keep all the technology running well. And now let me introduce you to our speakers. They'll each be on for about 15 minutes and then we'll do a Q&A session. If you have a question, put it in the chat, we'll pick it up and then share it with our speakers. I'll just introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. Will Buie is an associate oral historian at the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. He's a former interviewer for the Rutgers Oral History Archive. I first met him in that capacity, and he was highly praised by friends who he interviewed, friends of mine who he interviewed. He's now researching the impact of 9/11 on health. Next, we'll hear from Deidre Dinnigan, president of the Archivist Roundtable of Metropolitan New York. She's a principal of For Keeps. I think that's a great name. Document and help us begin to document and understand the history of our region. Then we'll hear from Mike Frisch and Christine Ridarsky. Mike's a professor of history and American studies at the University at Buffalo, SUNY. He's written and lectured widely on oral history. I met him in the very first grad school course that I took in 1979. And lately, with Rand Force and Talking Pictures, Mike's been exploring the intersection of oral history, digital technology, and social media via the PixStori app. He'll say more about that later. He's working closely with Christine Ridarsky. Christine is the city historian of Rochester, New York, and she's also the president of the Association of Public Historians of New York State. They are working on a terrific project with the PixStori app that documents reactions to the pandemic all around New York State by county. That means each of the 5 boroughs of New York City has their place in their recording system, and you can go to them and get perspectives from people who are living through the pandemic in all 5 corners of New York City's boroughs, and then move on to the rest of the state. Finally, we'll hear from Savona Bailey McClain and Nadia, DeLane. Savona is executive director of the West Harlem Arts Fund. She's organized major art exhibits and installations all around New York City. She's done a lot of work on Governor's Island in particular. Nadia is a multimedia designer and visual storyteller. Her work has been widely exhibited, widely published, and her visual work has been screened at major film festivals. Together, they're working on a fascinating COVID Diaries POC project, which documents the people of color's reactions to living through the pandemic. When we look at the terrible inequalities that the pandemic has exposed, I can't think of a more important topic for looking at and producing for our public. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will, and he's going to get us going by talking about oral history.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Gale and Lisa and Madison, working behind the scenes. The first thing that I want to say is that I know that things are starting to open up. They're starting to open up here in New Jersey, in New York as well. So if you're going to start doing oral history interviews in person, safety first, listen to the experts. You know who the experts are and who they aren't, hopefully, and follow the appropriate safety guidelines. You also want to, at the very beginning, start thinking about why you're doing an oral history project. Out of all the other areas that you could use to explore this time, why do you want to engage in oral history, or why do you want to join an oral history project? There's not a wrong answer to that question. Oral historians welcome more people to the field broadly, but just think about why you want to get into it and what you want to get out of it. If you can, I strongly encourage you not to go it alone. Look for a partner or a partner organization that you can join and lend your efforts to. That's important for all kind of administrative, logistical, and frankly, mental health reasons, given the stressful time that we're in. Having a partner or a partner organization during this will be really, really beneficial to you. Another thing that you want to do early on is find a repository. Find somewhere for your oral history interviews to live, for those digital files to call home, and call up that repository. Speak to someone there. Find out what kind of file formats they accept. Find out what documentation they require in order to receive your donation. And another thing, I hate to say it, but it is worthwhile to maybe asking what the contingency plan for this organization is if for some unfortunate reason they have to shut their doors. What's going to happen to the recordings that you turned over to them? You just don't want them to disappear into the ether. In terms of your own projects, you want to create a project tracking sheet early on as well. You're going to have lots of different balls in the air as the project goes on, and the project tracking sheet is a great way to just make sure that you maintain your sanity and you understand where different things are at the different stages. You're going to have potential narrators. You're going to have narrators that you've already interviewed. You're going to have transcripts that are in production, transcripts that are in review, transcripts that are out with the narrator. So a tracking sheet will just bring you a great peace of mind and let you know that, hey, I'm on top of everything. Things are in order, hopefully. Get to know your equipment. I'm not going to advocate any particular product here now, but whatever you choose to use as your recording interface or your microphone or your recorder, get to know it inside out if you can. Your documentation is important. I already mentioned the documents that you're going to want to have familiarize yourself with for the repository. But let's say you're a first-time interviewer, it's going to be really beneficial for you to generate an interview guide. Even seasoned interviewers use an interview guide. In that interview guide, you're going to populate it with lots of open-ended who, what, when, where, why, how type questions. Generally, avoid yes or no questions. They tend to not elicit as substantive a response as some of those open-ended questions will. But use a guide if you can, particularly if you're just starting out. It'll help you stay on task. And there's other documentation that you're going to need. You're going to need your consent and release form. You're going to need your deed of gift form. So just sit down, make sure you have all that documentation ready. Have someone else look it over if you're a first timer and you're not part of an organization. And just make sure that, you know, all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. And the last thing I'm going to say about before the interview is make sure you get a good night's sleep. If you're a person who doesn't usually get a good night's sleep, try to get the best good night's sleep that you can. You don't want to do your interview tired. I have a friend of mine, she says you don't want to do your interview tired, hungry, or hungover. So eliminate all of those things and make sure you're well rested, fed, and ready to go on the day of the interview. In terms of the interview, I'd actually, if I could take a minute, set this up by reading a quote from one of my favorite oral history articles. The article is titled "The Unsaid, the Incommunicable, the Unbearable, and the Irretrievable." It's by an author, Henry Greenspan. And I'm just going to quote from the article directly. He writes, "In direct response to my half question, so this story, Leon insisted about all his Holocaust retelling. It is not a story. It has to be made a story in order to convey it, and with all the frustration that implies, because at best, you compromise." Now, Greenspan goes on to unpack that in the article, but we can also take that literally. It emphasizes that for as much work as you're doing, setting up, getting the narrators, conducting the interview, the narrator is also doing work in the moment in a creative process to convey this story to you. This dialogue is a creative process on both of your parts, and have an appreciation for what the narrator is doing will make it a much better interview experience for both of you. Now to go on to some of the more specifics, choose your location wisely. You want someplace quiet, free of interruption, even free of ambient noise if you can. Check all your equipment prior to the interview. Literally, make sure your recorder turns on. If you're going solely battery operated, that might be the case. Make sure that your batteries are charged. Make sure your microphone's working. Make sure everything is plugged in as it should be. And then maybe even double check it. I'm very paranoid, so I'll double, triple check. I'll set my stuff up an hour before the interview if I can, and then check it again before the narrator sits down. It just gives you a good peace of mind. At the start of the recording, you're going to want to say what you're doing, who you are, who your narrator is, what the date is, give your location, and then if you're interviewing remotely, your narrator is in a different place from you are, maybe give the narrator's location as well. Also, at the beginning of the recording, you want to try and get a little bit of background information. There are all kinds of different styles of oral history interviewing. No matter what style you're conducting, either a live course interview or on the opposite end, a laser focused type interview on a particular topic, just try and get a little background information. At the very least, if nothing else, It helps grease the wheels. It helps to get the narrator used to talking and answering questions, but there are other reasons why you want to do that as well. It's really important to ask one question at a time. It's tempting to stack questions, 2 or 3 questions. That can be really confusing, as you might imagine. So if you can, ask a question in one complete sentence and then be quiet. Silence is a friend. Unlike our normal everyday conversations and dialogues where that silence becomes awkward very quickly. This is not to say that silence can't be awkward in an oral history interview, but it's really, really useful. If you want to think about how the sequence should go, you should ask a question. There should be a period of silence. Then the narrator will answer. And then there should be another period of silence after you think the narrator has fully answered their question. And in that space of time, that narrator may think of something else that they want to say just because they want to fill the silence, or they may be doing the work of creating a story from their memory that they want to deliver to you and they just haven't been able to do it yet. So really let the silence rest. I always tell people, look, ask a question, wait until you feel that little bit of an uncomfortable sensation, and then wait another beat after that before you continue on. It works miracles, trust me. At the end of your interview, try not to let your interview end on a down or sad note. I conduct interviews for the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, and people ask me all the time, how do you do that? Isn't that really difficult? The way that I do make sure that my interviews don't end on a really, really down note is to ask people questions about the future or their outlook or where they see themselves going or what's happening. People that have been through the experience of 9/11, I found by and large, either have gone on to do really good things with their lives or with each other or for someone else, or they've got a really great outlook on life because they are alive, and getting them to focus on the future or some work that they've done going forward or look forward to doing is an easy technique to do to bring the interview around if you feel like it's going to end on a sad note. If you can't do it during the interview, do it when you turn off the recorder. I regularly have a 15, 20, half an hour conversation with my narrators after I turn the recorder off. Sometimes it's about what we talked about during the interview. Sometimes it's about something that has nothing to do with why the person is there. But don't be afraid to just be a regular human. Set the oral history interview aside and just have a chat. And that can also be a way of getting the person back to at least a neutral footing before they leave your presence. At the end of the interview, thank your interviewee. Collect any documents that you need signed at the time. Everyone who's practiced oral history, I feel like, has forgot to get those signatures in the moment, and you hate to go back and have to track somebody down. So try and get it done at the time of the interview. If the interviewer doesn't feel comfortable signing your release forms after the interview, if they want to read a transcript or they want to listen to the recording before they sign those documents, by all means, that's fine. And I've given people that option regularly. But if you can, try and get the documents right away. If you're recording remotely, negotiate how you're going to get those signed documents. That's really important. After the interview, try and find some small amount of time before too much time elapses to jot down a few notes. Those notes will be about your experience in the interview, reflective of your own practice and what you thought about it, and also highlighting some things that you want to focus on that the narrator said. But try and do that sooner than later if you can, while things are fresh in your mind. These next two things that I'm going to say can be collapsed into one. You either want to transfer that interview recording off of your recorder to your hard drive, a server, or cloud service as soon as you can, and make plans to deposit it with your repository. I'm at the museum, so that's my repository. So those two things happen simultaneously, but you want to try and get that recording off the recorder into someplace safe or safer as soon as you can. In general, it's good to have some type of debriefing when you finish with your interview or a set of interviews. If you're part of a group of people, maybe you want to schedule a debriefing section by week or bi-weekly or once a month. It serves, one, to identify maybe common or different threads that you all are talking about. Maybe you'll find a new line of inquiry based on something that your colleague is talking about. But also, no one's going to be able to talk to you about the process than someone else who is going through it. So maybe you've had a stressful interview, or you didn't like the way you performed, or there was something that happened between you and the narrator that you're not 100% comfortable with, excuse me. But those deep briefing sessions can serve all kinds of functions. And I think it's really important if you're part of a group or a partnership to try and schedule that. There are other things that are going to happen that are specific to your project at the end here. So it'll depend on what your end product is. You'll either be generating transcripts or indexing the interviews and preparing them to put online or preparing them for an exhibit. And all that stuff will come after your project is done and be project specific. But the things that I've given you today, along with some of the resources that are going to be dropped or going to be sent to you all, hopefully will give you enough to go on to get started and ask more informed questions about your practice and what you want to do and what you want to accomplish. So with that, Rob, I'll rest and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Will. I just want to say that in 40 plus years of doing oral history, I've made just about every mistake that Will described.
So have I.
If you listen to Will, you can avoid the errors that I committed. And for those of you who are worried about getting more resources, know that the resource sheet we send out will get you started. And later in the week, we will send out another more research sheet with information about oral history organizations, like the Oral History Association, Oral History in the Middle Atlantic region. All those will have websites that give you all sorts of resources on everything from doing an interview to the technology that you might use to the way you might begin asking questions of folks. So you're going to get more from us and you'll get a chance to ask questions as well. We're now going to turn it over to Deidre, who's going to talk to us about the archival dimension of collecting in this time of the pandemic.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Gale, Robert, Madison, and Louisa. I want to send across there it is in the chat, some references I'm going to be speaking to later on in a few minutes. And I want to do a screen share as well so that you can get a sense of what I'm talking about, my points as I move on. There we are. So Gale mentioned the Archivist Roundtable, of which I am the president, and I wanted to sort of summarize for a couple of seconds what we are. So we are an archiving organization. We're founded in 1979, and we consist of about 400 or so librarians, archivists, and record managers in the New York City area, representing about 160 repositories. We're the largest local organization of our kind in the United States. And our mission generally is to educate on archives and manuscript collections, provide a forum for our professionals to discuss professional topics. We promote professional development through education and educational experiences and opportunities, and we advocate for the preservation and use of historical materials. Rob was also talking about me, but it was sort of blurry for a second. So briefly, I run a small archiving company called For Keeps Inc. And I guess my work is really meets where archiving and storytelling merges. So I build archives from the ground up, but I also create plans and manage projects that use archival materials and historical content. So that's me, the work that I do, and art as well. Today, my talk is titled Documenting Periods of Turmoil, which is entirely appropriate, of course, specifically to archiving COVID-19. But as Gale mentioned, it can be used, of course, to document materials that relate to the criminal justice pandemic that's also going on. Generally, it's inclusive, though, of any sort of traumatic event that is happening on a large scale. So the recommendations that I'm going to make today are useful for like situations and events. So let's get started. Again, just sort of, I had this in mind, and it's a good thing that Gale mentioned it, and Robert as well, that archiving is a field that is sort of shrouded in mystery. So to sort of demystify it a bit for you, I'm going to just offer some quick distinctions. The term archives, for example, with a capital A, is the repository where archival materials, where historic materials are kept. It's also used to represent the materials themselves. To archive, the verb is to put these historic items and documents into through this process of evaluation and assessment to identify the historic value, to document the value as well, because there's a lot of paperwork that's included in archives, to perform preservation efforts such as encapsulation and to prevent deterioration and damage, etc., and to create paths of access. Archives and collections are different, of course. We all have collections at home, comic book collections, figurine collections, photographic collections. But in order to name it an archive, it has to go through this process that establishes its historic preservation and future access principles. So I hope that sort of clarifies and demystifies the field that I work in. An archivist like myself is responsible, of course, for processing the materials and often is responsible for managing the repository. So we archive the verb and we're also responsible for archive the place, the noun. So hopefully that demystifies it for us all. So we are about to discuss COVID-19 documentation. And the big question, of course, for everyone is, as they start their COVID capsules, is what to collect and what to donate. So where do we start? What you do is you take sort of stock of where you are and you take notes of what's happening around you, and you gather materials that are relevant to the experience. COVID-19 materials are being generated in both digital and analog forms. There is a plethora of materials out there that is available for collecting. And generally, in my noticing, these materials tend to fall into these two groups or categories. They either document the way that we are living or how we feel about the experiences. So signage, placards, notices that are on building fronts or changes in the menu that have been published, neighborhood flyers, etc., tend to fall into the category of the way we're living. And by that, I mean, it tells us what we should and should not be doing. Or, you know, we cannot access this premises because the timing has changed. We are to stand 6 feet apart, like the signage that's available that is on display in the park system. And then the category of how we feel, I think that's more or less what we're talking about here in oral histories as well. We're documenting through writing and artwork, photos, drawings, paintings, etc., how our own COVID-19 experiences. Oral histories provide us with an opportunity to do both. We can talk about what we're seeing, but we can also express how we're feeling. And these are two ways of documenting the COVID experience, and both are useful because they reflect the realities that we are seeing around us. Nothing is too mundane. I know many of you are asking, you know, is it even useful to take this flyer? Well, I'll tell you, yes, it is. If it mentions COVID-19, if it references COVID-19, then it is important. It's an excellent find, actually. Something to remember when you're collecting, when you're out there, is for each of the items you collect, it is useful for you as the collector. And if you choose to deposit or donate your materials into an archive or repository, then you need to collect the metadata as well. The who, what, when, where, how of each item. In the long run, it will serve you the purposes of archiving better than just sort of grabbing everything that you can find. Start collecting now. From 2 months ago to now and 3 months from now, the types of materials that will be available for you will change. I went around my neighborhood looking at flyers, and there, you know, you have the handwritten ones to the printed ones to the more official ones that brands are creating. And those weren't available for me to take right now, but in 2 months they will be, or maybe 3 months, or maybe 6 months, depending on how things progress. So the process of archiving as a responsibility is ever changing, and you have to stick with the project and be considerate, of course. Don't take, you know, flyers and stuff off the wall as they're being used. So archiving. So now that we know what to collect, then what do you do with it? You can keep the materials in your closet, you can keep it in your garage, but I think the wisest recommendation would be to offer them to a repository where they can be kept, preserved, documentation can be created around them, and they can be accessible to not just you, but to the larger community. Many institutions are collecting right now, and they're staggering their collections. What I've noticed is There is a strong request for digital items and for oral histories, and that is, I believe, primarily because the archivists and those who are working with materials are not currently back at work. So to receive tangible documents might be a bit of, cumbersome right now if they're not in the charge of anyone. So what I've noticed also, I have put the categories of institutions that are receiving materials into these larger sort of subject matter thematic categories as well. So academic institutions, for example, are collecting documents that that record the changes in student life, their virtual learning experience. If you have kids, you have college grads, you know that they've shifted to virtual learning. And academic institutions such as the CUNY University, that's also in the link that I provided. The CUNY University of New York, all 25 campuses, are documenting the university's responses to the university's learning experience. So from their students, they're requesting photos, narratives, screenshots, social media threads, etc., hashtags that document how the students have adapted, are adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic. Historical societies are slightly different as well. And I point to the New York Historical Society and the Brooklyn Historical Society, who are collecting aspects of health. So the heroic efforts of healthcare and essential workers, for example, the experiences of the sick. They're also interested in the economy, the effects on businesses, schools and cultural groups, social and political and religious impacts of COVID as it hits the borough. So the work of the Historical Society is generally broader, and they're looking for documentation that is wider than the academic institutions. The public library is also collecting as well. Brooklyn Public Library has an oral history program called Our Streets, Our Stories, and the New York Public Library, specifically the Schomburg, is, as we understand, are looking to, they generally document the experience of the African-American, or the Black diaspora to be specific. And so the Schomburg is looking for documentation that shares, that addresses the racial disparity in health outcomes and access, the impact on Black owned businesses and cultural production, the impact on the city through state, local, and government responses. And there are other community organizations as well that are collecting targeted stories and experiences. So the LGBT Community Center is collecting, their project is called LGBT Quarantine Archive Project, and they're looking for requests, they're requesting photos, artwork, memes, diaries, and electronic items that shares the experience of that community. StoryCorps is also collecting oral histories, since that's a strong discussion point today. StoryCorps Connect, through a virtual platform, gathers your stories and along with a photograph, and eventually sends it to the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, sorry. But if all of your collections are digital, consider donating to omeka.net. And that platform is all things textual stories and digital objects. So images, videos, tweets, Snapchat, memes, PDFs, screenshots of the news, and emails. So if your collection is strongly digital, that's a platform to consider. But generally speaking, these are the categories of institutions that are accepting materials and the types of materials that they are asking for. One thing that these institutions are going to require from you is a permission form, so deed of gift. If you're online, if you go to any of these links that I've sent out, they're going to ask you to simple questions, who, the who, what, when, how, the metadata information I talked about, to include in your deed of gift. But the deed of gift is really a document that transfers ownership from you, the collector, to the archive. And you online now, because usually it's more complicated in the archive, but online you just have to fill out that information, and you can then donate your materials as well. Anonymity is also an option when you collect and donate. I would recommend that you don't only because your story is important and your name in the historical document is equally important. But if you do have to, if you want the anonymity, you can also specify that in the deed of gift. So I think that is generally where we are with the types of documentation that you can collect and the repositories options that you can send them to. If you have any questions, my email is on the screen and you can find me through my website as well. I hope you found this small presentation useful and inspiring so that you can go out and contribute to the mass documentation that is on the way. I recommend it. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deidre. That is really informative and inspiring, and it really connects really nicely with the oral history projects we've been hearing about and the work that Will did to get us started. Now I want to turn it over to Mike Frisch and Christine Ridarsky, whose project with PixStori, I think, really in some ways is a great meeting of oral history and archival work at the same time. And please, Mike and Christine, take it away.
Okay, well, I'll start off and then Christine will follow. I'm an oral historian for a long time and been involved with a great many projects. I really loved Will's introduction. I too have made all of those mistakes and been in that place doing long interviews and discovering how easily you can get tangled up in them. A few years ago, not really too many, I began getting involved in actually a very different approach, which I thought had nothing to do with what I'd done before, but turns out to have a lot to do with it. And we got interested in essentially starting, not so much with the long interview, which is the staple of most oral history, but with the idea of very short interviews anchored to a photograph. People love telling stories about photographs. They do it naturally. It's kind of, I think, almost a natural storytelling mode. And we developed essentially in the first stage a mobile app that allowed people, whether informally with their family photographs or in organizational form, to basically take a photograph and develop a short comment or story or narrative or response to that photograph. We found it's a very productive mode. You get a very distilled, concentrated response. I like to say that the narratives that are produced are grounded but not bounded by the photograph. Often people can locate the photograph in about 15 seconds, 20 seconds, but these usually go on for about a minute, and then they take off and they make a connection and they go someplace that really gets at what they really want to say or what's interesting and what's important to them. We also find that the power of a still photograph and a moving voice is actually almost a new medium. You keep looking at that picture and you're listening to the story about it or the person take off, and you're actively putting the two together in what can be a very important way. So this we've been developing for a couple of years. We recently brought out a new platform which is totally cloud-based, a web app, so that it opens the path to real crowdsourcing. People can take their own pictures or provide a picture from their family album, wherever they are, and tell a story about it, and these can then be gathered together. I began to think of this as a kind of mosaic approach to oral history. Instead of a long interview that you then cobble down for an exhibit, you start with small pieces, and you put them together, and you end up with what can be a very large picture of a community or an organization or a moment such as we're passing through now. Well, it became clear pretty quickly that this mode was almost ideally timed, I suppose. We just brought out this web app, the cloud-based version, which we call PixStori Plus. PixStori is the larger name of the app, Picture and Story. And the opportunity for this to be used for COVID documentation was really almost self-evident as people began to encounter it. It allows for crowdsourcing at a time when people couldn't even be visited for live interviews. People can respond to the way the interviews often work is that instead of it being a Q&A as in traditional oral history, the interview can take the form of a broad photo prompt. How has your life changed? What has, what's gone on inside your house in response to being cooped up there for a long time? What about who do you miss or what do you miss? People can rummage through their photographs. So we start often with a general prompt, and then people can decide what to take pictures of. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. And that is a kind of bottom-up agency right there. They're deciding exactly what image to produce that in a way becomes part of a dialogue about the broader subject of meaning. And they then comment on it and tell a story about it or reflect on it or go someplace in what seems to work best at about a minute or a minute and a half. So what we are struck with, and we're seeing this in a number of applications, this is easy. It doesn't involve specialized equipment. People can do it from any computer or any mobile device. You just go on a browser to the site, you upload a picture, you take the picture, you tell a story about it by pushing a button, and you end up with a multimedia unit, maybe a minute and a half long, with one still photograph and a comment about it. They tend to have potentially enormous power, and I think what's beginning to happen, and this is where I'll show just a couple of examples and then we'll pivot to Christine, you end up with the possibility of a kind of modular piece that can be put together to tell larger stories. Because they're modular, they can tell different stories. You just rearrange them and it can be specific to a group or specific to a neighborhood or taking a theme. We now have 25 PixStories from around the world about hand sanitizers. You know, you could have a whole little, it's from China to Florida to Wisconsin to New York. So the potential of starting with something small, being able to receive it, and then working with it in a collection form that documents, I was really struck with a lot of what Deidre had to say, that can document exactly that level of things that are kind of ephemeral. The signs, we have one of the hand sanitizers is a brewery in Florida. I don't have time to show this today. A brewery in Florida that gave out hand sanitizer with its logo, the brewery's logo on the envelope, you know, for anybody who came in and bought a case of beer. So things like that, which will disappear very quickly, become the kind of archival documents that can be literally recorded in the photograph. People can tell the story about it. These can then be brought together and collected. So Christine, what we're finding is, I did a Zoom thing for the International Federation of Public History. We had people from maybe 20 different countries around the world. And the potential of having a method that can build these collections wherever people are, as long as they have access, you know, through a mobile device to the internet, is, I think, and these can be then coordinated, is potentially very, very significant for transnational work. I mean, it's a global pandemic, and we really need global documentation as well as local documentation. So let me just show you a couple of quick examples. One of the first big projects that's been organized is what Christine will introduce, the Association of Public Historians in New York State, which has, I think, 1,600 members, and they in their communities, and hopefully many of the people in our session today, can begin using this platform to have local PixStories made with their community that then could be shared. They're sortable by your locality, but they also become, in this sense, part of a statewide collection that Christine will be introducing. So Madison, if we can just call up, let's say, the first example so people get a sense of what this looks like. No, the first one, my mother.
I have.
Yeah, that one there. We can blow it up a little bit and.
Hi, folks. You know, there's one good thing that happened because of this virus, that my girls and I would come over to whoever house we're invited, and we sit in the driveway, and we talk about life, and we talk about the virus, and we talk about appreciating everything. And I feel that after this is over, we're going to be a better world, I think. I hope. Okay, guys, take care. Be safe.
Well, in its own way, a powerful statement. She's 93 years old. This is how they look like they're very distant, but it's clearly a very powerful moment for her. If we could go to the second one.
Hey guys, I'm Martha, the second-year master's student from University of Buffalo. I'm here today to share how coronavirus influences my daily life. So the picture I uploaded here is my closet to put my daily clothes. After the school shut down, after spring break, so the big influence to me will be like, I never wear this clothes again because I just stay home every day. So my daily mood will change my day pajama to night pajama. And besides this, I think another big influence for me will be some emotional change. Since I'm an international student and all of my family is back in China, so there's no family support and friend support around me. All of the panic, anxiety, and worry, these negative emotions I have to deal with by myself. But even though we need to keep social distance, this kind of event can still connect us together. So if you can share your story here, that would be great. Yeah, have a good day.
Just two things to point out there. This is a good example. The general prompt was just, how has your life changed? So she decided to take a picture of her closet and talk about the clothes that she may never wear again because her life is in some ways fallen apart. So very powerful. And then, to me, it's a wonderful example. She then, having spent the 15 or 20 seconds describing her day pajamas and her night pajamas, she then is launched, and she is talking about her parents and what it means to be alone thousands of miles from home and unable, not knowing what's happening with them, what's happening to her life. And you go back, if you listen to it again, she says at the beginning, I'll never wear these clothes again, meaning that's really what her fear is. So to me, in just a minute and a half, a minute and a quarter, you get literally a story, a whole story about a way of life and what that impact is. And if you imagine thousands of these, not just 100, and what you could do to then work with them thematically and put them together in exhibits, they can pack an enormous punch. They're easy to get. People can do them. We could get, I think if you think of Manhattan, you could get 10,000 stories like this, which is a lot more than the oral histories that you could collect, and they would have that kind of quality. There are many other examples I wish I could show, but I wanted to shift now to Christine, and she can talk about the Association of Public Historians in New York State's project and how everybody in our session today can use PixStori to essentially become part of that project.
Thank you, Mike. So as was said at the beginning, I'm the relatively new president of the Association of Public Historians of New York State, and our organization represents the 1,600 plus government appointed historians in New York, because as I'm sure many of you know, New York State requires every municipality to have a historian. And so as this pandemic began and we started to be forced to stay at home, members began to recognize the need to document what was happening around us, but like everyone else, feeling restricted by the fact that we were largely stuck at home. And I have been working with Mike for several years now on a variety of different oral history projects, ranging from more traditional projects to the new PixStori application. And it occurred to me at that point that this could be the perfect type of app to use to begin to document this pandemic while people were stuck at home. So it really strikes me that this app allows us to do a lot of different things that we can. Yeah, I just accidentally muted myself. Okay. So, we can allow people to contribute on their own from home. And, you know, I think as Mike can tell you, when you're doing oral history, any of us who have done oral history know that it works best when you can be with a person and help to prompt them. But since that wasn't a possibility, we decided that rather than having dialogue between people, we could offer the option of having a dialogue with a photograph, something that people could do from the comfort of their own home. And so that's where the PixStori project came in, and we decided as an association to launch this project that anyone in New York State could contribute to, and that our historians across the state could use it as a means of documenting their own communities. And so we set up this project, and I shared in the chat and also here on the screen the invitation to join this project. And what anybody can do is share this invitation. You can share it on social media, through email networks, on your websites, whatever it is, to ask people to start contributing to this project. And our goal is to create a statewide archive, but also to then share these out with individual communities as well, so that we will have a statewide archive through the Association of Public Historians. And I think one of you mentioned earlier about a plan in case anything were to happen to the organization. Our records will go to the New York State Archive should our organization ever dissolve. So we work closely with the state historian. But we will also ensure that copies of these get to the local historians, or maybe where there is not a local historian or a local historian can't handle them, we'll get them to the historical societies in the communities. And so knowing that we wanted something that would be accessible, we used the Association of Public Historians, decided to use PixStori. And so when you go to that link that I just shared with you, you'll see an introduction to our project. And it does include a rights statement saying that by participating, you agree to have these contributed to archives and to be published or included in exhibits, etc. We also provide a tip sheet that we hope will help guide people. And if you're going to this for the first time, you'll get an invitation to actually join PixStori. And because I'm in as a manager right now, you're not going to see that. But we've tried to make this very, very clear for people so that anyone can do this. And this includes a tip sheet that provides information that walks you right through the process. And so it is very, very easy to do. Once you get in there, you click on Make a PixStori. And one of the things that we've done to make this useful to people all across the state is we've included some different options. One is you can write your own title, but we're giving you some prompts here too, to help people think about ideas that they might want to talk about. The other thing we're doing is requiring people to choose a county. So this allows us to sort these stories once we're ready to share them out. And then it's as simple as uploading a photo, or if you don't yet have a photo to share, we give you the option of choosing a photograph. These are just very generic photographs that are taken off common license sites. But you know, if you know, a lot of people, I don't know about you, we've been getting all sorts of pet photographs being shared through our workplaces. People are stuck from home, so maybe people want to share a cat photo, something like that. And then once you've uploaded your photo, it's as simple as pressing the microphone to record, and you have a story right there. And so we've already gotten about 30 stories in our project, which was launched just a few weeks ago. And I thought I'd also share one with you, since this is the best part. So this is actually contributed by a historian in a pretty small town in, I believe, upstate New York, or
which is a very well-worn phrase in this day of the COVID-19 pandemic. I am handling how I get my mail.
Is there a problem?
We're not seeing it.
You're not seeing it? Oh, I'm sorry. Seeing it now?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Differently than I used to. My mail comes through rural route delivery, so I get it in a mailbox. I bring it into the house, handling it as little as I possibly can, and I put it in this basket, spray around the disinfectant, wash my hands, and I let the mail sit for 3 days to sort of cure and make sure the nasty germs have died. I may be a little overreacting. You should see me when I come back from the grocery store. But that's one of the things I'm definitely doing differently since the COVID-19 pandemic began.
One of the other things that I really like about this application is that it allows for dialogue. And so within the app, there is the ability to have people respond. And in this case, we actually had someone who responded to this PixStori with their own recording.
I think I'm handling my mail too soon. I like your idea. We're going to learn from each other by listening to these stories, I think. I usually just leave my mail in the mailbox till the next day and pick it up. I don't know why I made up that rule myself, but I think now I'm going to leave it in a basket at least for a day or two. I don't need to look at it that quickly, and maybe I'll be doing myself a favor. So thank you very much, Delaware County, for your advice. And you're not overreacting. I may compromise a little and shorten that time a little, but I will take a little bit of what you have taught me.
So the other thing that I think is important to mention here is that, you know, PixStori acts sort of as a social media platform, but the recordings themselves are not proprietary. So we will be able to download these recordings. They get downloaded as MP4s. So it's a video file, and we're able to upload them to YouTube or save them in our own personal archive too. So it allows a lot of variability in how you archive these materials going forward. Now, one thing that we've been thinking a lot about now as the state is starting to reopen and people are starting to gather in small groups is what's the next step? And so we're starting to think about putting out guidelines for scheduling PixStori parties where you invite people to come to your house in small gatherings, appropriately social distance, and maybe bring a selection of photographs so that you can sit together and share your photographs and record stories about them. So there's a lot of possibility here, and the idea that people could do this alone in their home or alone or in small groups is one of the things that is very, sorry, I'm seeing we're at 20 minutes here. One of the things that we're doing that can be very useful going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine. It's a really exciting app, and the project that Christine is working on, I think, is perfectly suited for our times and the needs of lots of small community organizations that want to get their voices and experiences out through social media. I encourage everybody to follow up by looking at Christine's link, because actually I think PixStori is harder to describe than to do. I've been doing it with great pleasure for a number of years, and it's really delightfully simple, but it lets you do very sophisticated things. Just to respond to one question, no, you don't upload video, you upload a still picture. But I think you can say a lot to a still picture. And although there's no limit on the amount of time you can speak to that still picture, I found it possible to say some really useful things in about a minute, maybe even 90 seconds that are really rewarding. And I think lots of people will enjoy using it. I want to move on now to Savona and Nadia. There's a long history of engagement between oral history and the arts, and your project is really important for understanding the total impact of the pandemic and the voices of people who've suffered most acutely. So please take over now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to thank the borough president for inviting myself and Nadia to talk about our project, COVID Diaries POC. And it really began because of you, Rob. You had a meeting in April talking about how to collect different memories and narratives from New York City residents. And there was this discussion that for people of color, there wasn't a lot of documentation from past pandemics. I volunteered to do it, and it led to the project. And our project is more creative than just collecting diaries. Just to alert the public, we partnered with a youth-based organization, Exalt, which is in Lower Manhattan, and we have intern Julius Michelle, who is actually doing interviews with people via a phone app. We're using rev.com. They have two different new apps. One, treating the phone as a mic. The second, to actually call people and record the conversations. Then those conversations are given to Nadia, DeLane, and Nadia is creating soundscapes out of those conversations. And I just want her to start off talking about collecting those diaries and how she's turning them into soundscapes, which will be a public art project. So Nadia, do you want to start sharing?
Sure, I'll share a bit. So just a little background about me is I'm a visual storyteller. I've been working in film and doing several multimedia projects. But one of the things I enjoy a lot is collecting stories from community members, because what we start to see emerge after even just 5 interviews are patterns. And so that is one of the big things that I discovered in working on this project. So many patterns and commonalities between the interviewees around mixed emotions about being in quarantine. You know, some folks really feeling trapped, others feeling like it's a moment of freedom because they finally have some time to themselves. You know, these are the mixed emotions and sometimes poetic reactions that you can get when you leave someone with an open-ended question that they can then respond to however they would like. So that's been one of the rewards of this project so far, is noticing those patterns, because I feel like one of the great aspects of collecting oral histories is bringing people together around the things that we do have in common. And these very human emotions are emerging right now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, yes, I was just saying that this gives an opportunity to expose large audiences to the very human emotions that we're all experiencing right now. And another component that's important about this project, of course, is the work of Austin Arrington, which will bring people out into open landscapes to hear the soundscapes while they're looking at nature. This will bring the story into an open field so a person can be with the voices that they're hearing. And what I'm doing with the soundscapes is I want to take some of these patterns that I see emerging, pair them with classical music, instrumentation, sounds that reveal emotion, so that folks can hear sort of a chorus of reaction. Sometimes a person's voice will be by themselves. Other times you'll hear this 2 different people saying the same thing, but they're saying it in 2 different tones of voice. So these are the types of nuances that I'd like to capture. Of course, it's still a work in progress, but I'm excited about it because I think that what we'll get are not just reactions to listening to it, but a co-creation of narrative that will result from everyone getting a chance to experience these stories. So that's what we're working on. That's what I'm working on right now. And I'm so excited to be able to collaborate with some of the musicians and narrators.
Can you hear?
Nadia? Yes?
Yes, I was chiming in while they were trying to bring you back in. I was trying to explain to the audience why this is so important. Historically, in the United States, when it comes to people of color, particularly those of African descent, our voices, our bodies, the way we are treated has always been very marginalized. And there's a long history from all of the pandemics, starting at the smallpox pandemic in 1633. But in particularly, it came with experimentations on Black people. And a lot of that is directly related to racism, which is the second pandemic that we are dealing with right now. And that is not just police brutality, but the criminalization of Black people and all of our behaviors. So therefore, there's this long history of sort of denying our needs, but not just that, it's to dispel myths that were promoted that were totally untrue to deal with the collective shame of slavery. So for instance, it was about a doctor, Dr. Thomas Hamilton, who needed to prove that Black people had thicker skins than those who were considered white. So he did experimentation on a slave that was given to him so that he could prove his theory. And he actually damaged that individual to such a point that they escaped, left the United States to go to England so that he could then be free of all of those experimentations. He wrote a book, Slave Life in Georgia, a narrative of the life, sufferings, and escape of John Brown, a fugitive slave now in England. So that's one example. We have several other examples of various programs that were going on to actually hurt people of color. The belief from a 1787 manual that Black people didn't have a lot of lung capacity and that they needed to be in the sun when it was hot and that doing work in the field would help their bodies. All of these were false myths to justify ill treatment, experimentation, to deal with that collective guilt. So now, moving fast forward, we're in a position where we're in this pandemic, and now people of color, all people of color, are suffering disproportionately from this pandemic. So it's all about blame. Blame that, we have pre-existing conditions. Blame that we don't take better care of ourselves. Blame that we don't eat the proper foods. So in this project, where we're mixing meditative sounds and music, we're allowing people of color just to be themselves, just to share their reactions, just to be human. And then we're going to go to different locations. Our first will be on Governor's Island with a memory opus that Nadia is developing, and a garden by Austin Arrington where it's peaceful and folks can listen and heal themselves. So I want Nadia to tell you more about how we're putting these memory opuses together.
So I spoke a little bit about what I'm doing as far as multi-layering these stories. I don't know how much of it got lost in the technological difficulties, but that is my primary goal, which is to take interviews that have commonalities, group them together, and create these soundscapes in the hopes that folks are able to listen to these stories and gain some healing or gain some feeling of connection around listening to these stories with the various sounds that I'm going to use. So it's a great opportunity to have community members come together at a time when we can't be together physically, and collecting these files digitally. And that is the goal of the project, is to actually give honor and respect to these stories that are often not heard from a multitude of populations. Yes, many of the interviewees are from New York, but what's happened is that some have gone back to their homes of origin because of the circumstances. And so we're getting an even larger audience and more exposure to folks that are, some are staying in Seattle right now, some are in California right now, even though under normal circumstances, they'd be in the city. So we're getting a really great view on reactions to what's happening in the moment.
And it's of all ages, and we want to express that because we are capturing voices of young people, but we're also capturing voices of seniors, professionals. So therefore, it also shows the diversity of people of color and their lifestyle and what they're engaged in, because that too is a misconception that, you know, just because you're of color, you're catching the disease. There are direct links to medical disparity and poverty, and we're trying to bring that to the forefront so that people would have more empathy, but more than that, to actually bring about some positive change. Because if we don't do that, then this cycle of ignoring the health needs of people of color will continue. And so, Nadia, do you want to tell us so far how many diaries we've collected with the help of Julius?
So far, we've collected about 20 diaries with the help of Julius, and they're of varying lengths and different styles as well. I love the spoken word poetry. There's music. There are people singing a cappella. There are just sound reactions. There are tears being shed. Some are longer interviews where folks are talking from a more political standpoint, what's happening for them right now and the transitions they're going through. Some are talking about loss of relatives. So for me, I haven't done mine yet because I have many things that I would like to record, and I like so many of you have spoken about note-taking as being an important part of this. And so there's a meta-narrative happening, and I'm excited to share that as well. So we're getting a plethora of reactions. It's not just one thing, and I think that's important to highlight. We're not going to have just one story. All of these stories are important, and silence around it is not going to work for us at this moment in history. So moving forward, it's just important to appreciate the texture of these stories that are being told right now.
I think that's a great project that's underway, and it connects really nicely with everything that's been said before. I'm getting questions now in the chat box. I'll just answer one really quickly. If you want to learn more about oral history, the Oral History Association website, Oral History in the Middle Atlantic region, Southern Oral History Program, these are all going to be in the resources sheet that we send out. You'll be able to look up lots.
Okay.
I just want to point over to Deidre because a couple of people have asked the same thing. They say, I'm interested in doing interviews, I'm interested in being interviewed, but where should I send my interviews? Where will these interviews live? Can you offer people some guidance about where they might want to pitch their ideas? You've shared some really great links to really great projects already.
Yes, StoryCorps, as I mentioned, is collecting oral histories. So you might want to reach out to them, and they also collected via their sites. I know I interned at StoryCorps a while back and did my own project there. They used to send the material, the interview, not content, the devices to your house. You take this, you collect the interviews and then you'd send it back, they'd process it and send it to the Library of Congress. Now we're in quarantine, so StoryCorps Connects is doing this virtually. So that's one way to record your story. If you have collected an oral history, many of the institutions that I mentioned are also collecting. If your story isn't related to an academic institution, consider sending it to a community organization. So the Brooklyn Historical Society is collecting oral histories, the New York Historical Society as well. Think about where your story will fit best based on the theme and start there. But the community institutions, I think, are more general, and you can reach out to them. There's in the resource page, you'll have the links. And of course, I can, of course, continue looking to find something that's more specific if you reach out to me, if you're not getting to what you need. But the important thing is to just keep recording, and because these stories are being collected, you'll find a home for them.
More questions? Here's a question that comes from Marion Schott. And I think really, Will, you could handle this one best. What measures do you recommend to protect the personal health information of interviewees and donors and those people they may mention in their oral history or donations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first place people might want to go to is HIPAA, but that really only applies to healthcare providers and universities and colleges. The best thing that you can do is to be upfront with them about what's going to happen with the recording, how they're going to use it, and tell them. If you don't want anyone to know about your health state or an illness or really anything, don't mention it. I tell everyone at the beginning of my interview, I'm going to ask you open-ended questions. I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to let you talk. If there's something that I ask you that you don't want to talk about, either with a wave of your hand, verbally, or with an eye signal, let me know. I'll move to the next question. You won't offend me at all. This interview is about you and what you want to talk about. So be upfront with them and let them know they're not obligated to share with you anything that you want. On the back end, once you have your transcript or your index, let's say, during the review process, a close review will identify problematic points in the oral history interview that you can then go back to your narrator and make sure, hey, you said this, it might have implicated this person in a situation. Are you sure you want to keep that in there? I recommend that you take it out, and then you go from there. So before the interview, be upfront, and then after the interview, go back and raise a red flag if you see one.
Deirdre, do you know of anyone who's accepting videos as part of their archiving project?
On mute. I mentioned Omeka.net as a digital resource that's accepting videos because it's digital. But the community organizations, as I said, it's so general that what they are accepting that you may be able to donate the materials that you have there as well. I think I'm trying to remember off my list what else would be more specific. When you look at the sites or that the categories of sites that I mentioned, they have a full description. I tried not to read it in my brief talk, but some of them list videos as well. So if you're thinking of donating to an academic institution, a community organization, or something, a more specific subject, thematic collection, then they would indicate that on their receipt notice online. I'm speaking primarily of online because that's where the requests are being made right now.
Nadia, you just made a great post in the chat. Could you follow up on that and talk a little bit more about the commonalities that you're finding, you're hearing in the interviews?
Right. So what I posted on the chat had to do with what might seem to be a conflicting emotion someone's experiencing, and I've heard a few interviewees share that they hate the circumstances of the pandemic, but have appreciated not having to interact on public transportation, let's say, or not having to go into their place of work for a specific amount of time, that this might be the first time in their lives that they've had several weeks to be in their home space. And, that's one of those conflicting emotions that gives a story a lot of texture, because of course no one would say, I'm happy the pandemic is happening, but there are some personal life impacts that are leaving people with, mixed emotions about whether this was a good or bad thing. And that's oftentimes what you realize in storytelling, is that there is not just a good or bad outcome. There's no way to say that the pandemic is positive, but there's a lot of creativity that's emerging from folks having a moment in quarantine. And so, it's problematic to discuss a lot of times, but ultimately there will be mixed reactions to something like a pandemic. And, I've had personal life impacts in losing several family members to the virus already in a short amount of time. And so for me, you know, I wouldn't necessarily have an overall positive outlook on this, but I'll also say that being in quarantine has allowed me to complete some projects that were on the back burner for 5 years plus. So these are the types of commonalities that I've noticed so far, just in giving people the freedom to speak their minds about something like this. And that's just one example. There are others as well, feelings of sadness, feelings of being trapped. So, you know, I could go on, but the biggest commonality of what I am noticing as far as tone, people are expressive in a way that is so poetic and musical. When they just have that, I'm not being watched by a video camera right now. I can just speak into this. I can speak into my phone and share something that's just very authentic to my current experience. So I'm noticing just a lot of poetry emerge from people who I didn't expect it from. Some of the narrators are folks that I know, and I've never known them this way before. So that's what I'll share.
We have a question from Mark, who's a teacher, and he's wondering about the best way to archive his students' perspectives on the pandemic that were recorded on a Padlet. And can somebody speak to that in some way? Where might he find the best home for those? It's hard for me to answer because all the work I've done has been done on an iPhone or a Mac, right? And beyond that, I'm sort of lost.
I don't know a lot about Padlet, but I think that allows people to upload and record things onto it. Is there a way to download the materials that have been contributed? And if so, I think it would be those downloads that they would want to contribute to the archive. But I guess without knowing more about the program and how it operates on the back end, it's hard to answer that question.
Nadia and Savona, we've got a question about the sound you're going to be working with and how you're going to layer the sound in your works. Could you tell us something about that?
So I don't want to endorse any specific products. I don't want to do that, but I will say that as someone who's been working with very limited resources for many years, there are so many apps and programs out there, some of which are just made primarily for video, that where you can layer sound tracks on top of one another. I'm fortunate because I have music producers in my family and I know a lot of musicians. I don't call myself a musician and I really don't even call myself a sound artist. But what I saw was a need to tell the story this way. And so that's what I'll be doing, is finding the vehicle necessary to tell the story this way. And so I've selected an app that I'm not going to share right now, but I have tracks and I have the interviews. And what I'm doing is I'm pairing the sounds that match the emotions of the interviews that I'm collecting. So I'm separating them into various categories, 3 actually, and matching the sound to the categories.
Let me just add to that with regard to PixStori, because I think the genius of PixStori is that the technology is very simple, but that frees you up to do a lot of interesting things, including layered sound. I first did a lot of work on PixStori when I was teaching in Korea, and I would go, for example, to big public events where there would be music, there would be drumming, there would be singing, and I would practice at getting the sound of the singer or the drummer in the background by holding and speaking and holding the phone another way. So suddenly you had a layer of sound. You had ambient sound in music, drumming, or chanting, and then my action over the top of that. And my friends loved them. I loved doing them. And because the technology was so simple, I could play with it for a long time until I got good at it. And it was easy to learn, but gave you a lot of room to improve once you got started. So I think very highly of PixStori for people who want to experiment with the same kind of thing that Nadia is doing with a more sophisticated technology.
Okay.
I want to go back to Mark's question. I'm sorry for going back. But Mark, I just saw that you sent the question earlier today about Padlets to the Archivist Roundtable's email. I know I saw that word, but I had no idea. And I'm, as Christine said, I'm not quite familiar, but because you sent it to the Archivist Roundtable, we collectively, the board members, will find you the resources that you need. So FYI, that's part of my resource page. If you have a question and you're not sure, and I don't know the answer, or the panel doesn't know the answer, please feel free to reach out to the Archivist Roundtable and we'll try to find the answers you need and direct you to the proper resource. So thank you, Mark, for that email earlier today.
Just to let the audience know, if they want to learn a little bit about our project, they could go to our site, westharlem.art, and you will see NP exhibit space and MP Garden. And then it downloads our residency program and also the memory opus. So therefore you get to see who's a part of it, all the various artists. And in several weeks, we'll be able to announce when the first opus is completed and people can come to visit on Governor's Island. Any other questions?
Well, I'll just make a comment while people are coming up with other questions. I was really interested in Nadia and what you were saying. A useful thing we'd be very excited to work with people on. PixStori is a platform that can gather these things as multimedia units, but then they're exportable in any number of ways, and that means the video can be taken out, the audio can be, is a freestanding audio. You can essentially begin working with it, you can edit things. So it might be the possibilities of getting this kind of vernacular material that people can produce in this informal multimedia way, and then working with it in more of a production storytelling mode like you're describing would be really interesting. And I also was very struck by your comment, which we see a lot, that there's something about people not being on camera in video that, and we see it in making these PixStories, it's just a space that they enter and they often are surprised by what they say. There's something about, and there was another question that went by on the chat thing about video, and at some point we may try to build video into this, but I'm really struck with the power of still photographs that are not rushing you along and pulling you along. And so when people have a chance to really look at them, they just go someplace. And where they go, as I was saying before, is interesting and surprising, perhaps surprising to them. But the thing that Nadia mentioned about really hearing a level of expressivity and poetry and emotion that is not at all what she was expecting would come out of this is something we see an awful lot in these short little narrations where in the space of a minute, people go like that young woman talking about the clothes that she doesn't wear and ending up talking about being 5,000 miles away from her family, that really get to an emotional place that is powerful and surprising to them. So all of this can be worked with, and you can take the materials and export them in all sorts of ways for web use and so on. So we're really open to people playing with it as much as they can.
Well, we're looking at using PixStori in a different sort of way, dealing with history in New York City and people of color. I was looking to take photographs of locations around the city that are pertinent to Black people, and then adding layers of audio that would talk about those spaces. For instance, I was looking at the Irish Memorial in Lower Manhattan. And the reason for that is because of the history of policing in New York City, as well as in Boston, where policing was supposed to rein in new Irish populations. And then it turned out to be a great job for these new immigrants coming from very rural backgrounds. But there's this history between the police and the Black community. And I thought by taking the picture of the Irish Memorial, because of their pandemic, the famine, the potato famine, we could then delve into some history and show some commonalities about poverty, about forced labor, about how did we get to this position where we're fighting amongst each other. Another location I'm thinking about is Weeksville in Brooklyn, because that's another historic village that is still around today, and it has a lot of feelings for a lot of people. So we are thinking about doing that, to have these sort of digital experiences as well as our audio projects, which will also be interactive.
Well, that would be really easy and an ideal application. Christine has experimented a little bit with putting in what we call seed photographs, but this would be a more deliberate use. And instead of people taking their own picture, you can have in the interface, you can have a gallery of pictures, and then they can select one and tell a story about it. We're doing some of that in some neighborhood projects, really two actually in Buffalo. One, this is not so much COVID related, but it would touch all these things, including the other pandemic in terms of racial justice that's been talked about. So we have, one is an African-American roller rink. There was just an article someplace about the whole history of Black roller rinks in America. Well, in Buffalo, for over 35 years, they took pictures of everybody coming to have a birthday party in this roller rink, and all those pictures were on their wall. And talk about archives, they were about to head for the dumpster because they were remodeling. And somebody made a contact with a local college, and a good librarian there said, well, we don't know what we'll do with them, but we'll take it. It shouldn't go to the dumpster. And they now have all of these digitized, I think there are something like 4,000 of these photographs, in which over 30 years, this whole African-American community over generations has passed through this roller rink. So they're now hoping to mobilize a crowdsourcing project where they can put those pictures up there. People will find themselves or their cousin or whatever, and identify themselves, tell their story, and really begin in this mosaic way to compose the history of the community. When we talked about that with a city councilman, and he just went wild. He said, well, there's a florist shop on one of the major former commercial streets that's trying to be revived now. He said every funeral in our community went through that florist shop. You put up a picture of that florist shop, and you're going to get a lot of stories, and they won't just be about flowers. They'll be about the life of that community, but they will take off from somebody remembering their mother's funeral and getting it set up there and then where that went. So I think the idea of provoking with a powerful photograph like that, a kind of focused memory response and story response is very, very powerful and likely to be very productive. So we'd love to talk with you about that.
Any of the panelists hearing something that prompts a thought from them that they want to add? Just to chime in on what Mike said, which complements what Savona is working on so nicely, there are so many terrific digital repositories of photographs now, including our own municipal archives and the Library of Congress, that you can pull up first-rate historical photographs of scenes and events. I mean, I'm constantly dazzled by it as I do photo research. And I think to use those period photographs of a location and then have someone speak to it today is tremendously powerful, very evocative. Somebody who's on the chat has made the point that there are forms of reminiscence therapy that use this kind of use of photography to get people to think and reflect and talk. And I just think the depths you can go into are really extraordinary.
Well, then that draws in the parallel of Franklin Roosevelt and all of his projects, WPA, FSA, because that was the reason why he did it. He wanted to have documentation to convince America as a whole why they should be empathetic to populations that were being devastated by the Depression. So we're kind of doing the same thing today. We're trying to build empathy of various groups of people who have been marginalized so that the rest of America can understand we have more in common than not just our day-to-day lives, but certain experiences, so therefore people can see. I think of Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks was the only African-American photographer in the Farm Security Administration, taking pictures of rural Southerners to build that empathy. So we're kind of all moving in the same direction, that there's a need to constantly document and show why we need to be more caring about each other.
One additional comment, I can put this in the resource list, Rob, before you send it out. There's somebody made an early use of PixStori in a public group. It had nothing to do with us. I've never seen anything like it, but it was remarkable. And what they did, this was in a real oral history archive. It's in Montgomery County, Maryland, an African-American community. And they basically took some historical photographs and then went into their oral histories, which, like most oral histories, are just stored there someplace, and they queued up excerpts and they put them together in a PixStori form over these photographs. And suddenly you had a multimedia extract from your oral history with something to look at. It's very, very powerful. And I'll send out the link. If you just go to PixStori Plus, I can even send out the link directly because it's a public group and you'll be able to see them. It's just remarkable. And it was just a creative way to take archived oral histories and really put them into use immediately with some visual material, which they also had in their archives. And suddenly they had, in effect, an online exhibit without having to strain at all.
We have a closing time of 4 p.m. We're at 3:45 right now. And any questions that anybody wants to bring up from the Zoom audience out there, time to put them in. Panelists, maybe to think about maybe some summary remarks, anything that you want to speak to before we shut down.
Well, we're just going to let the Borough President Office know when we have our outdoor installation up and invite people to come. It'll be by appointment because they're trying to practice social distancing. So that way they get to, they're doing it, so they can enjoy the sculpture, the garden, Nadia sound installations in a very supportive, warm environment.
Christine, anything you want to add? You've been really active giving people good ideas in the chat.
I just want to start by thanking President Brewer and you, Rob, as well as Madison and Louisa for putting this together, and thank everyone for all of the work that you're doing. I like to say that New York State is probably the most well-documented state in the nation because of the network of historians that we have here. And we're going to be at the forefront of documenting COVID-19 and the racial protests. So I want to thank you all for this tremendous work, and let me know what I can do in my role as president of the State Association to help any of the work that you're doing. I appreciate it.
Will, you want to get in? Any last thoughts?
I'm just really excited that oral history has been such a common thread through everybody's discussion. I wasn't expecting that, but that's exciting to hear. I hope people do go to the OHA website and really get a good grounding, some practical advice and some theoretical advice there. But I wish everyone luck. The various oral history projects. My email address is wbuie at 911memorial.org, and my Gmail is williambuie at gmail.com. So if anyone has any questions or comments that they didn't feel like sharing here, please hit me up. I'll be happy to discuss them with you.
Deidre, can we reach you in your tropical paradise and get many final thoughts from you?
I second what William and Christina said. This has been an amazing experience and a very worthwhile project. I'm excited to see personally what the city is going to do. I've spoken about, you know, the various institutions that are actively collecting and documenting. But I haven't seen anything about what New York City itself is doing. I don't know who's responsible for that, if it's the Department of Records and Information Services, but there are so many brilliant minds here who are dedicated to making sure that this pandemic and this experience is remembered for posterity. And I'm just excited to be a part of it. And if I can help in any way, of course, I'm here. You've got my email, you've got my website. And you can always reach me through the Archivist Roundtable. So get out there and start documenting and, you know, yes, making history.
Nadia.
Hello, thank you all so much. This was really inspiring and enlightening. And I appreciate this opportunity to share about something which is very important to me, visual storytelling and oral history.
Mike? You're muted.
Sorry, Mike, you're muted.
So I am. Now I'm unmuted. So I wanted to again thank the borough president and Rob as well, and really all of you. It's been delightful to meet you, and I think we've opened up a whole lot of ways in which there's so much that's difficult about this moment that we're going through, but the idea that it's opening up pathways to doing things that probably needed to be done anyway in terms of documenting and sharing things is really a very exciting meeting ground for all of us. So it's really a privilege to be part of the discussion. I look forward to staying in touch with all of you, and if any way that we can be helpful in helping you shape our little PixStori thing to whatever uses you might want to make of it. People are taking it in all kinds of directions, which is what tools are all about. It's not about doing a specific thing. Then we'd be delighted to, I think I put my email up in the thread at some point, and get in touch and we can follow up individually.
Borough President Brewer, anything you want to add at the end here? Okay, I think that brings us towards the end of our conversation. What I want to say is something I've said every time we've had a meeting on this pandemic horror, which is that every time people get together, they come up with more and more good ideas. Every time they get together, they end up doing more than they imagined they would be doing, and it's produced a lot of good work. The abundance of really good oral history projects, really good archival projects is just really impressive, and the heart and the intelligence that people are bringing to this are really deeply moving. This is a very difficult time for a host of reasons, but there are all sorts of reasons why the work that everybody put in today makes me optimistic about our future. So I want to thank Borough President Brewer. I want to thank Will Buie, Deirdre Dinnigan, Mike Frisch, Christine Ridarsky, Savona, Bailey, McClain, Nadia, DeLane, and Madison Marlowe, and Luisa Lopez for all the great work and great ideas. A resource page is going out that will enable everybody to dig in further on the presentations you heard today. And then later on, another resource page which will go into depth. This event has been recorded. It'll be available online before too long, and the Borough President's Office will send out a link on that. So our deliberations today don't end today. They carry on into the future. And deepest thanks to everybody who joined in and everybody who made such heroic contributions. Thank you all very, very much, and stay well.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you all.